Okay, I think we should start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the second day of our council meeting. I'm Anthony Dworkin. I'm a senior policy fellow here at ECFR, working, among other subjects, on international order and multilateralism, in which the subject we're going to be discussing in this session looms very large. And, of course, this session follows on extremely well from the dinner presentation we heard last night from Professor Mearsheimer, in which he described the coming face-off between the United States and China as the central question and perhaps the organizing principle of international politics in the coming century. And if the strategic competition, or even perhaps military competition, or military conflict is, for the moment in the future, the economic wars and trade wars are very much part of the present. It's already happening. Someone once described trade wars as good and easy to win, but the US-China economic competition and trade war that we see today does not look like it's fitting into that pattern. Instead, it is turning into what seems to be a shaping principle around which many countries are beginning to reorient their trade relations and their economic policies. So the question is, I think, how far is this going to go, and how should we interpret these trade wars? What are the different partners looking for? And fundamentally, of course, where does the EU fit in? So I would just highlight, before we come to our speakers, what seem to me three distinctive features of this trade war. And of course, there are a number of trade conflicts the United States is engaged in, but we'll be focusing above all on the US-China question. Three features, three questions that it raises. First of all, I think what's distinctive about this, it's the first time that we see a major economic player within a liberal rules-based trading system that has a fundamentally different economic and political model from the sort of free market, broadly democratic liberal model that has been a feature of the Western approach. And so there is a question there, I think, about how far this kind of state-driven, heavily subsidized, undemocratic economic system can be accommodated within a broadly free-trading, liberal trading system. The second question is, again, going very much to what we discussed last night, is about the interplay between economic and other security questions. Can we have a close trading relationship and mutually advantageous win-win trading relations with a country which is at the same time a major strategic competitor and is increasingly seen that way not only in the United States but in Europe as well? And of course, I should remind you that the American national security strategy contained the phrase, economic security is national security. So where do we draw the line, or can we draw a line anymore, between the economic and the other security aspects? And the third feature that I think is looming increasingly large here is to do with technology. Because, of course, technological innovation is reshaping not only the way we run our economies, but the way we organize our security, and is touching every aspect of life. And here I have a third quotation, which is from President Putin: "The nation that leads in AI will rule the world." So again, I think conceivably that makes it harder to make any kind of clear separation between economic advance, and we know that China's economic program is driven very much by a desire to establish itself as the leader in new technologies. Again, that distinction between economic advance and strategic competition is looking more complex. So where does the EU fit into this? This is our question. One could imagine a role for Europe, which I think many Europeans aspire to, in which the EU is kind of drawing China into reform, while at the same time persuading the United States to confront China within the system rather than going outside the system into a world of unilateralism and might makes right. Is that a feasible strategy? And where do other great powers fit into that? So that's what we're going to be discussing. We're going to have a short opening comment and perhaps one or two quick exchanges, and then we'll open it to you. And I think we have a great panel to discuss this. We have, starting on my right, Andrey Bradford, Professor of Trade and International Organization at Columbia Law School. We have Helle Thorning-Schmidt, CEO of Save the Children International, former Prime Minister of Denmark. On my left, Andrey Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. And finally, Marietje Schaake, shortly to retire as an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, where you have distinguished yourself by your focus both on trade and technology. And moving on to pastures new. So, Professor Bradford, let's start with you. If you could perhaps give your sense of where does Europe fit into this complex new set of challenges?
Sure, thank you. I think it may be helpful, I will move to talk about Europe in a minute, but just to spend a few minutes thinking about how unprecedented the fundamentals characterizing this conflict are and what is different from before. So first, what we see is this blurring between allies and enemies, something that the US is not only focusing on going after China, but going after its traditional allies, including Europe, Japan, Canada, Mexico, and that obviously constrains our ability to respond to the conflict. The second, what you mentioned, the distinction between economic issues and national security issues has been blurred, and I see at least three reasons why the US is choosing this strategy. So first of all, there needs to be some legal basis still in the United States, how you wage that trade war like this. And there are very few legal justifications and ways of doing this. So the US is pulling this Cold War era, very rarely used provisions from its trade law that have traditionally been used against, like in a Cold War against Soviet Union. But now it is used against, let's say, migrants coming from Mexico or cars coming from Europe. And the third sort of distinctive characteristics is the extent to which we are undermining the existing institutional structure that has been in place to resolve the trade disputes. Again, the extent to which the US is dismantling the ability of the WTO to intervene also constrains the policy options available. But let me then say a few words about where Europe fits in. So obviously, there are direct costs felt by European nations when the Trump administration is imposing tariffs on Europeans. There are also various indirect costs because it is very hard to quantify the extent to which the supply chains are being affected by the trade wars, the uncertainty that is creating to the business environment, and also then indirect costs, for instance, with this technology war against Huawei. The Europe, Middle East, Africa is one of the major markets for Huawei. It's the second biggest market after China, 30% of its revenue. So obviously any actions by the US government to constrain the ability of the American companies to supply and support Huawei phones will be then adversely impacting the European consumers. So the costs are rather obvious. So let me mention a few silver linings, if you like. I am not suggesting that there are winners from the trade war. Europe is going to lose from this, but there are certain elements where Europe can mitigate the costs or potentially think about beginning to manage the trade war. So one, what is interesting is that while China has been responding to the US tariffs with retaliation by elevating the tariffs against American companies, it has been lowering the tariffs vis-a-vis the exporters from other markets, including Europe. So as late as the late 2018, the average tariff faced by exporters exporting into China was 8%. Now it's over 20% for American companies, while 6.7% to other companies. So there's certain silver lining there that advances the relative competitiveness of the European companies vis-a-vis American companies. The second, while the Trump administration has been busy fighting the trade wars, Europe has been actually very active in expanding its trade agreements. So we are just in the midst of negotiating the Mercosur trade agreement. Australia is next in line. We concluded an agreement with Canada and with Japan. The downside is that there are only so many big deals that Europe can go moving forward, but those that we have concluded are significant. And the third issue that I would mention, that while the US is pulling itself outside of the international trading system, outside of the regional big trade pacts like the TTP, that creates a vacuum that Europe is in a unique position to fill in the following way. It is a phenomenon that I've described as the Brussels effect, which is the EU's ability to externalize the various regulations governing the single market by virtue of being a major market for multinational companies who need to abide by various regulatory standards imposed by the EU as a condition for trading with the EU. Often it is in the interest of those companies, for scale economy and other reasons, to apply those standards across their worldwide operations. So the EU rules and regulations begin to govern the entire global economic system. And the less we have trade agreements as a vehicle to set alternative standards, the more the default rule is going to be and continues to be that we trade based on the standards that are set unilaterally by the EU. So with those remarks, I think there are some silver linings, but again, I am not advocating that this is a great opportunity or there's a windfall that the Europeans should be celebrating.
Thank you very much. So at least there is a sort of a network out there that the EU can continue to influence, and perhaps strongly so. Marietje, you've looked obviously closely at the role of technology in modern economies and modern life. How far do you see this technological competition as something that's going to really dwarf and come to dominate international relations and sort of absorb security concerns as well?
Thank you for the great introductory remarks by Professor Bradford. I will just build on that by indeed agreeing completely that the EU has stepped into some vacuum, but when we look at the technological developments and the way in which technology, trade and economic relations, security, but also very much human rights concerns are increasingly blurred, I see much less leadership from the EU there, unfortunately. We've only recently seen a presentation of an EU-China strategy, only after there had already been the formation of 16+1 kind of assemblies, which make it seem as if there are some EU member states that gravitate more easily to Beijing than to Brussels. And I think that is a very concerning development, where we already see a lot of fragmentation between member states before the strategy is even rolled out. But it's not only fragmentation between member states, also on competence issues, which make it harder for the EU to be strategic here. So while national security is decided by the member states, for example, also in their assessment of Huawei and whether there are any reasons for concern that would legitimize blocking the company from entering into a country, we have a single market. And so this kind of fragmentation or tension, let's say, between competences is very unhelpful if you're trying to be more strategic, operate more globally, and use your economic weight towards national security efforts and those coming together in the technology realm. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of celebration and touting of the success of the General Data Protection Regulation, and indeed, there I think you can see the Brussels effect that Anu talked about in sort of full effect, because there's not only countries that have adopted the GDPR, but also companies like Microsoft that effectively operate on the basis of European rules globally. But those who say that the EU is a regulatory superpower and who celebrate that as a big success, I think would be well advised to also look at where growth is going to come from. And I think particularly when it comes to the technology and the developments of AI, we have to be much more focused on what the European way, which I really don't like calling the third way, because it seems to be accepting a sort of ranking at the third position, but what the European way really looks like. And if we want to have a chance of that being successful and also on the global stage really having an impact, we have to be much more coordinated and connect the economic and technological interests to the EU becoming a geopolitical player, because they cannot be seen separately anymore. And I think one of the challenges that we face in Europe is that we could become, at least relatively speaking, less relevant. So a relatively smaller voice in the places where the rules of the game are being set, whether it's by force or by default because of the way in which technologies are built. I mean, governance of technologies is not only done by states from the top down, but also very much by corporations in the way in which they build the technologies themselves. And you know, that affects supply chains, that affects new fields like the Internet of Things and 5G, as we've seen very clearly. So I think Europe has a number of ingredients it can build on, being credible and leading when it comes to setting global trade rules, but it has to start engaging in setting the rules of the future economy, has to be much more strategic when it comes to China, and has to not accept just being a regulatory superpower without growth in order for that to actually materialize and not be a kind of theoretical promise.
Thank you. And perhaps in a minute we can come on to think about some of the ways in which the EU could pursue the more kind of coordinated approach you're talking about. But first, Helle, from your perspective, Denmark, obviously, a sort of small nation state that traditionally has relied very heavily on an open and rules-based trading system. Do you see that as under threat, and how do you see the EU as, how should it ideally respond to this environment?
Well, first of all, good morning to you all. It's great to be here. I was here on Monday, then I had to leave yesterday, but I'm back. I'm delighted to be in this panel, even though I'm not a trade expert, and I'm so happy that we have trade experts in this panel, and thank you for your contributions. Perhaps a more political view of how I think we should tackle, or some ideas to how we should tackle this issue. First of all, I think it is extremely important that we start in the European Union start seeing our trading policies as part of our general foreign policy. That's also the paper that we're coming out with the next 5 years, that all our foreign policy tools should be brought together in a much more coherent way so we can have one foreign policy. I think it's so right what you were saying, Professor, this about that in the US, for example, they're linking economic trade policies with security issues and perhaps other issues as well, and the territorial issues as well. And if the US is doing that, and of course other regions and countries are doing that, we need to be much more focused on doing that in the European Union. We haven't until now. It is very rare, for example, in the European Council, where I've been sitting at many meetings, that you have a comprehensive conversation about our foreign policies seen from an economic perspective, trade perspective, security perspective, internal security, external security, external border control. Also added to that is that the EU is the biggest development humanitarian actor in the world. All those parts of our policies should be brought together in a much more coherent way so they form one policy. And I'm hoping that the next Commission and the European Council and Parliament will make an effort to do that. And I forgot again, which is to our Africa policy, which should be part of this foreign policy. So this is, I think, very, very important, particularly with the new winds that we're having. And what is that? Well, I think we have to give a sober analysis of where the EU actually is in terms of China. And I don't think that EU has one-to-one similar interest in terms of China as the US. I think we have different interests, and we have to recognize that we have different interests. First of all, I don't see that the EU is in a geopolitical competition with China, and that should guide how we act in this situation. I also think it should be a very clear, we should have very clear understanding that the US is not looking out for Europe as they used to. That means that we have a US, which for the first time we have a US administration and a president who is against more European integration. We cannot trust that the US is looking out for us, and there is a small trade war between the EU and US, which is also influence and guide us when we have our policy. I also think that if we start treating China as an enemy, either in a cold or other kinds of war, then they will become an enemy. So that is why we have to be very conscious of how we treat China. And I feel that we should use the lessons that were also spoken about before. Europe has created second to none, like state-of-the-art trade deals over the past few years. The trade deal we did with Canada is as good as they come, I think. And when we have an expertise in this area, I don't see why we should be treated or see ourselves as a similar trading partner to the rest of the world as the US. So we have to see that we have different interests, and we have actually showed with our trading partnership that we are doing things differently. So that's another reason why I think we should distinguish ourselves from China. The more, I would say, financial reason is, of course, that for the past 2-3 decades, China has established themselves as part of our supply chain in terms of our industry, and now perhaps also a technological part of our supply chain. So in that context, we have to understand that it might not be that easy for us to just dismiss China as a trading partner when our ecosystem is so closely aligned. And the last thing, of course, which I think is a sad issue, is that Europe has turned out not to be competitive when it comes to artificial intelligence, technology in general, and that puts us in a different situation than the US, for example. I'm sure I haven't covered all of these issues, but I do think there is a vacuum. As you are saying, there is a vacuum. We have a special expertise in trading relations. We still, in the European Union, believe in a multilateral, rules-based trading system. We have different interests than the US. We have actually a closer relationship with China. And for those reasons, we need to have a very new and strategic conversation about our trading relationship with China, which distinguishes itself from the US in the areas where we need to distinguish ourselves, recognizes that, of course, China will never be an ally like the US have been and can be in the future, but that doesn't change the fact that China is not our enemy. We are closely linked to China in our industrial policies in many, many ways, and perhaps the best way to change China is to engage more in trade, is to bring up the issues that we clearly have of protecting the Chinese are protecting their own market, not respecting intellectual property. We have to bring those issues up, and perhaps we do that best by creating our own space, or a third way, or first way, whatever we should call it, our own space for our trading relationship with China.
Great, thank you very much. Some really interesting points there, which I'm sure we'll want to pursue, about the comparative positions of the EU and the US in relation to China. Of course, one power that we haven't mentioned yet is Russia. And there was, again, some interesting discussion last night at dinner about where Russia fits in. If we do see a sort of alignment where the US and China are kind of competing poles, and Europe perhaps as a third pole, which way does Russia go in that world? And what's the Russian perspective on the kind of geoeconomic competition of today?
Thank you, Anthony. Let me start with a kind of personal recollection. About 20 years ago, a decision was made in the Kremlin to start the Russian accession to WTO. And I was marginally engaged in this process, and I do recall how difficult and how painful the process was. It took almost 20 years to get there. And I still remember how helpful our European friends and our American friends were, especially at the final stage of this process. Obama considered assisting Russia in getting to WTO as a major reset objective, because he believed that that would anchor Russia to the liberal economic and political system. So ultimately, Russia joined the institution. That was in August of 2012. I followed the public discussion after that, and over 7 years, I can tell you that 95% of media coverage of WTO is focused on threats and challenges that W presents for Russia. Not opportunities, not new ways of doing business, but it's primarily defensive approach. Is Russia unique in this sense? Well, arguably not. There are many people in other countries who are fearful of globalization, who do not like free trade. Is Putin to be the only one to blame for it? Arguably not, because of course it goes much deeper into history, into culture. I think it's a lucrative subject for a cultural anthropologist to analyze why Russians believe that the outside world is hostile, unfriendly, and dangerous. However, I think that the current leadership is also responsible for that, because in my personal view, the mission of a leader is to heal national prejudices, not to exploit them. And what we see right now is that basically, the leadership is trying to exploit some of the deficiencies that we do have in the Russian society, in the Russian thinking, in the Russian approach to the outside world. Now, if you look at the current US-China trade wars, and not just US-China trade wars, but trade wars in general, from this perspective, I think that for the leadership in the Kremlin, that can be regarded as a tactical opportunity. Why? First of all, it fits very nicely into the picture of the world that Russian politicians have, or most of them have. We are subject to sanctions, but everybody is subject to sanctions. China is subject to sanctions, Iran is subject to, even Turkey, which is a NATO member, is subject to US sanctions. We stand for protectionism, but everybody stands for protectionism. So we're not different. So when they say that Putin represents a kind of archaic view on international relations, he can now say, no, I'm not about the past, I'm about the future. I am the prophet of things to come. So I think it's very nice to feel that you are not in the rear guard, but in the avant-garde of the global civilization. Even if, this future is not very bright. But second, arguably more important, is that basically, if the center of gravity in the international system is moving away from prosperity to security, if the name of the game is not economic development, but rather survival, if identity beats pluralistic, positivist politics, it means that the assets that Russia has at its disposal become more valuable. Hard power, not soft power. Power projection rather than economic interdependence. So I think that tactically, basically many in Moscow would say, well, no, that's what we didn't hope for, but what we predicted, and that's the world in which we are more capable to defend our interests than our opponents. However, if you take a more strategic look at the situation, of course, this growing potential, growing bipolarity between China and Russia has very serious problems for Russia. Because indeed, in this bipolar world between the United States and China, Russia has to make a choice. The freedom of maneuvering for the Russian diplomacy is shrinking. And if Russia sticks to China, it will not come without a price to be paid. For example, we can lose India in transition, and that's not a very good thing for Moscow. We are definitely going to lose Europeans, and again, the European Union remains the single largest trading partner of the Russian Federation, the single largest source of new technologies and on investments. Not China, it's the European Union, and it will continue to be European Union in the foreseeable future. Its share is shrinking, but it is still there. So I think that it is really important to keep in mind not just a tactical perspective, but also a strategic one. And finally, should the European Union care? After all, Russians should somehow handle their own affairs. And you can say that's not our business. I think that you should care about that because the Russian position in Europe is not dissimilar from the Iranian position in the Middle East. Russia is either a stakeholder not only in the security European system, but in the European development system as well, or it will always be tempted to become a spoiler. And I think that it's in our common interest to make sure that Europe works with Russia as a stakeholder, not confronts Russia as a spoiler.
Thank you very much. It's interesting and I think quite telling how our conversation has drifted or kind of moved inexorably to take in geostrategic questions as well as economic questions. Just before we come to the audience, I'd maybe come back with one quick follow-up. And I'm interested in pursuing this idea of how far we can pursue a kind of normal trading relations with China, we, the EU, or the kind of wider liberal trading world, given its system. Effectively, you said we shouldn't be seeing them as strategic competitors. We can have a mutually beneficial economic relationship. But Andrey, maybe if I can come to you first as a trade expert, do you see the possibility of, there are a lot of people, I think, who feel that the way that the Chinese economy is structured is such that it sort of systematically exploits or games the rules of the WTO in a way that gives it an unfair advantage. Can a rules-based system accommodate such a different kind of model? Is it, when we talk of encouraging China to reform or to compromise or the EU-China negotiations, are we asking, what are we asking them to do? Are we asking them to fundamentally reform their system, which seems a big ask, or can we somehow accommodate their rather different model with a few, greater transparency or whatever?
So I think it is one of the key questions that has gotten us into where we are right now is that the WTO system wasn't designed to accommodate big economies like China that are so distinctively different. And EU has shared many of the concerns with the US regarding China's behavior, whether it relates to the extent of the state involvement, state support of Chinese companies, forced technology transfer, the abuse of the intellectual property rights. So one of my biggest regrets is the extent to which the US-EU relationship has deteriorated, because there would have been a set of common interests where both EU and the US see eye to eye on how we should try to change China. The second question is whether even if you identified and agree on the need to change some fundamentals of the Chinese economy, how difficult it is given how penetrating this is in the Chinese economic system. And that is not a sort of small laboratory experiment that you are trying to carry out. China has an enormous interest vested in the functioning and the continuation of the multilateral open trade system. It is reliant still on export-driven growth, and it wants to maintain the WTO rules that have served China well. So in many sense, the bargaining power is not entirely in Chinese hands, and especially if the US and the EU were united and not dismantle the WTO system, I believe progress could have been made and some accommodations could have been extracted from China. But whether we could fundamentally reform China, especially with the weak multilateral system that we have in place, I am less optimistic about it. EU has been very successful through this kind of regulatory dialogue and direct technocratic cooperation to amend aspects of the Chinese regulatory system, but it has not made much progress in touching the fundamentals. And the idea that somehow bringing China in the WTO would over time create the kind of economic changes that would lead inevitably to some adjustment of the Chinese system, none of those have really taken place. So I'm not overly optimistic, but the US and the EU have not managed to even seize those few opportunities that a collaborative approach would have enabled them to do in terms of going forward.
Thank you. And Helle, just to pick up, because again, this was a subject you spoke to quite closely, you feel that the EU really should separate itself out quite clearly from this very kind of comprehensive US approach that seems to see China as a competitor across the board and a country whose growth should perhaps be stopped, certainly in the technological area. But how would you define then the boundary between areas where we should perhaps be concerned about Chinese efforts in, in technology and security, and the degree to which we can still have a mutually beneficial economic ties?
Well, let's be clear that my ideal world would be an EU and a US that work together on this issue and try to improve the WTO so it could actually survive a China which is becoming so powerful. So that's my ideal scenario. But that's not going to happen because the US is withdrawing and almost being in a mild battle with the EU now. So I think that's the big sadness of this situation. I don't think it's easy to deal with China at all. I have no doubt that there is, we all know there's intellectual property issues, there's protection issues, but there's also spying issues from China. And I've been sitting in government discussing the Huawei issues. And of course, it's an extremely legitimate question to ask for any government how much they want to let in a Chinese technological company of this magnitude. So I think those questions are very relevant. And of course, the EU have to be vigilant in understanding and doing the proper analysis of these questions and trying to accommodate and live with this situation. So I'm not saying that it's easy, but I also feel that we have to distinguish what we want to do and what the US want to do. I think what the US want to do, first of all, US thinks that Chinese technology advances must be halted. That is their basic point. They want to stop China from developing even further. I don't think that can be a European interest. So what I'm arguing for is that we define our interest. We try to work with the US as much as possible, but we don't let the US define our interest. And what I'm really worried about is because it's so easy. I've been in politics. I know how easy it is to make an enemy of another nation. It is so easy to make an enemy of the Chinese, and it's a populist, easy way to do this. So I'm so worried because it's very drawing the way the US talks about China right now, and I think politicians in Europe will be drawn to that way of thinking about China. So I also think politically we have an enormous role in trying to discuss how this is actually more complex than just us against the Chinese.
Thank you. Marietje, your comments, I think, about the need for a more kind of coordinated approach from the EU that looked across the regulation, human rights, privacy concerns, but also economic competition and security would have resonated, I'm sure, with many people in the room. But can you say a little bit more about how, in kind of concrete terms, we could begin to reframe ourselves to pursue an approach which did look a little bit more integrated?
Yeah, so there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done when it comes to building the digital single market. And I don't think it's necessarily controversial, it's just not happening fast enough. And so making sure that that happens so that we can actually present a European model also in very practical terms. Predictable regulatory landscape for businesses, whether it's European businesses that can then better compete, or whether it's foreign businesses that want to operate on the European market and not in an effectively fragmented market, which it often still is if you look at it from a regulatory point of view. And then we should use the credibility we do have when it comes to being more normative than the other global players, being more mindful of the role of people, the rights of people, the fundamental freedoms that are at stake, if digitization only means privatization or an instrument in the hands of dictatorial regimes. So I think we have a lot of good ingredients of track record of setting rules, being interested in having this human-centric approach, but needing to really step up the game when it comes to growth and enabling that growth. And in order to have a more global impact, I would urge the European leaders to look much more globally, to work with countries like India, to have a much more integrated strategy towards Africa when it comes to development and technology, because often we roll out, for example, infrastructure. We help facilitate getting the people who are not online yet online, but we do not look at all at whether these people's rights are protected. In a number of major countries around the world, there are no data protection rules. And I think China understands this a lot better now than Europe does, and is really harvesting, in many ways, data under the guise of modern day development. So it is very important that Europe starts to have an ambition, but also global outlook here. And that we also realize it's not only a competition, because I think we talk a lot about the fault lines here between China and the US, and then the US and Europe. And those are very important. I don't want to be naive about that, but I think another fault line that we're seeing now is that in the absence of rulemaking by governments at all, oftentimes, or the instrumentalizing of the private sector in the hands of, for example, Chinese state operations, we are seeing the private sector filling the vacuum itself. Many initiatives now being taken by private companies to say, this is what we think cybersecurity should look like. This is how we are going to agree to de-escalate confrontations over our platforms. This is how we are going to deal with free speech or online speech issues on our platforms. And so the sense of urgency for Europe should not only come from a US stepping away from the multilateral system or China being more assertive, but also from a private sector that is basically taking matters into its own hands. And I personally think that the only sort of model that can serve the interests and the values of Europe and its people is one that is based on the rule of law. So we have to develop a governance model of technology with great ambition that is going to show how the rule of law can also apply in an interconnected and digitized world.
Thank you. And finally, Andrey, you said that this more kind of disorderly world is perhaps a comfortable one for Russia, but maybe from a strategic point of view, less ultimately beneficial. What would it take, do you think, to reorient Russia's approach so that it pursues a more kind of a strategy more aligned with some of the European and perhaps US approaches? Is that something to do with the internal constitution or with the external way in which countries are approaching Russia, or a bit of both?
Well, my personal take is that Europe will be important for Russia if Russia gets serious about social and economic modernization. Russia can survive without Europe, it can even prosper without Europe if the commodities prices are high enough. But in terms of modernization, I don't think that China or any other Asian country can replace Europe. So the first thing is whether Russia at some point, today or 5 years from now, becomes serious about social modernization. Second, whether the European Union is ready to embrace Russia, because it is still an open question on the terms and conditions of this cooperation. And we failed in our cooperation even before Ukraine, because there were disagreements about how Russia should be treated, what about acquis communautaire, whether we really deserve a special status or not, and these issues have not been revisited. They have to be revisited, in my view. And finally, I think it is a metaphysical question, of course, but what we see right now is a competition between two ways to organize the economy. It's either liberal, free market economy, or it's statist economy with political authoritarianism leading it. And the jury is still in session. We don't know. Well, I tend to be more sympathetic towards the liberal model. I think it has more opportunities, but it has to be proved.
Good. Thank you very much. There's a lot of issues there to discuss. Let's open it up to the audience. Please raise your hand, and I think a microphone will appear. And we have a speaker over there first. Do we have microphones?
We will. Just a second. I'm sorry.
Okay. And do we have a second microphone that we could prepare? Yeah. Very good. Okay. It's over here. Yeah. And again, if I could ask you to introduce yourself in case any of the panelists.
Thank you. Kristi Raik, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute.
We have been talking a lot about the erosion of the global multilateral order, and as an alternative then in discussing the zero-sum rivalry and more kind of realist world. But then there is also the issue of to what extent China and maybe also other players manage to build their own competing institutional structures. This has been happening to some extent with their different normative approaches, which then lead to a more regionalized world with different regional orders that actually are different, have different kinds of systems, different kinds of states leading them, which is a different way of erosion of global order and not just going to the realist zero-sum, but a more regionalized world. So how would you comment that? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a few questions. Heather, I saw next.
Thanks, Heather Gravy from Open Society. I wanted to go a bit further on this issue of the future economy, which will be, a lot of it will be data-driven. We still tend to think of trade wars in the Trumpian paradigm of it's about tariffs on steel and cars. But this is a very 20th century view of the world economy. And in fact, what is really interesting is the way that the trade wars over trade of data, I think, will become an absolutely key issue. And as Marietje just pointed out, the Chinese have totally different expectations even from the United States. And of course, Europe has GDPR. GDPR has become something of a global norm and is already being applied, for example, in the United States, different parts of the world. But how far can we go with that kind of regional data norms as a way of, as a way of governing the global economy in this area? Is there a way of trying to actually bring the Chinese and others on board for global norms which are in some kind of global governance framework? It won't look like what we have now. WTO is not configured to do this. But I'd be really interested in your views on how does the commercial value of data, how does that work in this new system? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there's someone else right behind you
there. Thank you. Nicola Reindorp from Crisis Action. Can I ask all the panel to elaborate just a little bit more on the strategy for dealing with both Russia and China? You've made this very powerful case for having a more integrated approach at looking across security, all the dimensions of our interactions with both powers, and to having a more nuanced approach. Neither China should be an enemy. We heard Professor Mearsheimer yesterday talking about engaging Russia. But as we look on the one hand, elections being undermined by Russia attacks, we look at how to influence Russia's role in Syria, we look at where China is thinking, this powerful case that you've made about where interests may overlap and where they're different. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what that strategy of engagement looks like, that is neither enemy nor ally, both perhaps on the China and the Russia front, and what might be the immediate next steps? Helle, as you make your passionate case for the EU getting its act together on Marietje, your sense of let's have more coordination and coherence, what would be the immediate next steps to get to that more effective strategy?
Okay. Thanks. And I think there's a questioner right behind you.
Thank you very much. I've been a member of the European Parliament for the past 5 years. I come from Bulgaria. I believe that the central challenge we're discussing is how the European Union can develop a coherent approach to the whole range of trade policy issues, so that it can proceed vis-à-vis China, Russia, anybody else, from a position of a very clear understanding of the interests of the European Union, the European member states, and project that Brussels type of approach forcefully in international relations. And I believe that in this sense, this kind of classification, either a liberal economic order or authoritarian, doesn't serve us well enough, because I believe Europe has a different order, and it is a socially defined economic and trade identity. And I believe that it is superior to either of the other two because it is better attuned to the challenges of today and tomorrow. And talking about the consequences of the confrontation between, let's say, China and US or EU in the trade area, dimensions were mentioned like security, like technology, like rule of law. But I believe very central are the social aspects, the bread and butter, jobs and incomes aspects. And Europe should be very clear as to where the red lines are vis-a-vis China. I mean, when China tries to take over the whole steel industry of the European Union, certainly this is not acceptable because the European Union is very strong on jobs. Yesterday there was a appeal to respect Article 2, to respect the liberal values of human rights, etc. We should not forget about Article 3. Article 3 speaks about full employment, a social market economy, etc., etc. And I believe that we have been losing part of that commitment over the past years after the crisis of 2008, when competition and market priorities, ruled also by the European Court of Justice over social concerns, have moved us too far along the liberal paradigm. And I finish.
Thank you. Sorry, your point has come over very clearly. I think I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm just going to try and bring in a few other people. But thank you for your question. Any other? Yes, at the back there.
Yes, Calypso Nicolaitis, Oxford. Great panel and also very balanced in its optimism and pessimism. And you're all talking about the use of access to our single market as a source of power, the greatest source of EU power. And so I have two questions. One is, on one side, just simply from the EU viewpoint, how do we go one step further in that use by not just using the traditional Brussels effect to make trade conditional on regulations that we have inside, but on behavior of another country? We're starting that, but some countries around the world have said this might be going too far. There, you have labels of neocolonialism, etc. Or the difficulty of EPAs, for instance, with Africa, speak to this problem. So it's a very fine line, both in terms of power and symbolically. And Marietje was speaking to some of this. So that's one set of questions, is this line. But the other is you've all, and especially Anu and Marietje, said, well, we all agree with the US in so many ways about China, but we wish that this was embedded in WTO. Now, we know WTO is organized to make retaliation, to manage retaliation, to make retaliation legitimate. That's kind of what WTO does. But on the other hand, it doesn't have a legal basis, as Anu was saying, to make these retaliation based on the kind of things China does. Now, how do we convince the US that we can reform WTO when actually WTO has been a judge-based international organization since the last round in the 90s? How can we reform WTO in that direction? Is our discourse to the US credible on anchoring, pushing for change in China in multilateralism when we can't change these multilateral organizations?
Thank you. Well, okay, we'll take one more and then we'll go to the audience. We'll go back to the panel.
Yes, thanks. Axel Marschik from the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Very interesting session. Also yesterday we noticed we spent a lot of time talking about China. I think it's very typical for EU institutions. Actually, we talk about China. We rarely talk with China. The EU institutions do. It would be great to have here at the next session, possibly next year, some people also, some representatives from China also to participate in the discussions. For those who've been in China and spoken with Chinese, I think a couple of things become obvious. Of course, the Chinese believe that it's an aberration these last 200 years and that China has its place at the top. And that at the moment, however, they are still prepared to play by the rules of the international community, and that so far they still have to feed the narrative that they are a developing country. And as such, there might be a window of opportunity, one that is closing very rapidly, where China might be persuaded still to accept some of the general rules that we also believe. They are at the moment still prepared to accept coexistence with the liberal system as well. They are not, at the moment, still interested in the zero-sum mathematics, which require a unique and single winner of the game. And therefore, it would be wise also to engage with China and to find ways to access and some things to offer them. So what do we have to offer China in order to accept our liberal system as coexistent?
Thank you very much. So let me just quickly run through the questions again, and then I'll ask you to pick up on one or two points. So we had a couple of questions, I think, about regionalization. You know, are we seeing the emergence of an alternative set of institutions? And are we seeing, in this world of data-driven trade, are we seeing the emergence of kind of alternative blocks, of alternative visions about how to regulate cyber world? Then there was a question about strategy for dealing with Russia and China, a question about the distinctive EU approach being different from both, as it were, the United States and China, if we see those as alternative poles because of our commitment to not only a liberal market but also a social market. What role is there for those norms going forward? And then a couple of questions really about the degree of reform that would be possible in the case of China. Is the WTO system one that has the capacity to really drive reform in China? And conversely, is China at this stage open to some sort of compromise where they would see a value in preserving a rules-based system and accept principles of coexistence? So that's your menu, and I'll leave you a la carte to pick from that as you will.
A fantastic set of questions, and I don't think we can do justice to all of them, but let me take on two. So first, the question on the different standards in regulating data-driven economy. And I think we already have examples of the EU's ability to actually do really well in that race. And I am less optimistic on the EU's ability to change the way China or the US regulate the data-driven economy. But I'm more optimistic of the EU's ability to promulgate the set of rules that appeal to the multinational companies and that choose to conform to the EU rules with respect to their global operations. So one that hasn't been mentioned, GDPR, you mentioned yourself, but the regulation of hate speech online, for instance. So we have three competing norms. So one is the US free speech, First Amendment-driven approach that is very permissive. The other extreme is that China, and to a large extent Russia, is in that camp with Iran and the others that restrict enormously the kind of speech that can appear online. And EU is in the middle and has provided, through its regulation of being quite restrictive when it comes to tolerating hate speech, the norm that has led to companies like Twitter and Yahoo and Google and Facebook to revise their global terms of service, not to the US free speech norms, but to the EU norms. And various events around the world, the kind of heat that Facebook is now taking around the world, what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, the world events are vindicating the EU's position. And these companies gain very little by trying to defend the free speech and not to conform to the EU rules. So in many ways, I think EU shouldn't be trying to focus, it shouldn't probably try to put its effort in trying to change the regulatory approach of the Chinese, but Facebook just doesn't operate in China. So China is not setting the global norms there, but the EU rather provides reasonable norms that become the global norm. And that leads me to then Calypso's question on the backlash of this idea that the EU is making its norms to govern also the parts of the world where consumers and citizens don't necessarily share all the preferences of the EU. And I don't think this is a zero-sum game in the sense that when EU exports its norms, it does it at the expense of other governments and other citizens. In many ways, there are governments who are happy to free ride on the EU's ability to regulate, to have the resources to regulate and the expertise to regulate many areas of the economy that they cannot regulate themselves. So competition regulation, when EU goes after global cartels or blocks or restricts otherwise harmful mergers, there are many other countries that benefit from those decisions as well. The same when it comes to safety and environmental regulations. Yes, there is still the question that, for instance, in many of these markets, consumers may trade off differently the costs and the benefits and would not be willing to pay more for the products that are safer, that do not care as much about the data privacy. So I think it is a valid criticism, but to some extent it's mitigated by the idea that sometimes the governments are not willing or able, or sometimes are not willing, let's say because of the excessive influence of corporations in the regulatory process in the US regulatory status quo may not reflect perfect democratic outcome in the US. So EU may be actually, again, filling that kind of void and stepping in that sense. And in the end, when it comes to Brussels effect, the EU is only regulating its own market. EU is not imposing its regulations elsewhere. If the multinational companies choose voluntarily to adjust to the EU rules across their global operations, it is really hard to say that that is an imperialist strategy by the EU.
Thank you very much. Marietje, I don't know, maybe I can encourage you perhaps to deal with the question of these alternative structures that are emerging internationally, and also the question perhaps about China, if you have a sense of what China would be looking for in terms of possible coexistence.
Yeah, I'll try my best, but I wanted to make one more observation first, sort of generally as we think about this race for dominance, that's sort of the frame through which we look at the competition for example, AI, is that I also think there's a lot of backlash against a sort of tech utopia going on. And we see more and more that more connectivity leads to new and also more vulnerability, for example, to the democratic system, susceptibility to the effect of cyber attacks, etc. And also, I don't know how many of you have recently been in San Francisco, but often when we think about Silicon Valley, we think about the successes of the big tech companies, but we don't look so much to the excessive amounts of social inequalities and the real impact for people on the ground in one of the richest areas of the world. So I think there are, for Europe, questions to be asked about, is bigger always better? And if it's not, if a decentralized system with a number of, for example, hubs where innovation takes place on a more local level, how can we develop that? And also, how can we pair technological development with research to understand what the intended and unintended consequences are? But having said that, I think we generally have a very narrow window as Europe to govern or shape the free flow of data. That was also in a number of your questions. The Japanese have been very proactively addressing this issue also in the G20 context. And I feel like Europe has really dropped the ball there. We worked on a position in the European Parliament, but because of an internal fight between DG Trade and DG Justice on how a European model should look, it's simply been decided to postpone to the next Commission. Now, these kinds of delays and infights are really inexcusable if we look at the pace of change. And so as a result, we do not now have one sort of model chapter for digital trade and trade agreements, even though we could have rolled it out sort of horizontally as a way to not only say there will be flows of data across the world, which of course there will be, as there will be flows of goods around the world, but then to pair those flows with a set of rules governing them to have sort of first mover advantage. So that's a real missed opportunity. The WTO has actually themed its report last year around e-commerce and digital trade. So it was the year of the return of protectionism, and still the WTO focused on digital trade. So I think it understands very well how important it is. On the other hand, it has teamed with Alibaba and the World Economic Forum to launch an WTO initiative. So sort of free trade in the economic space, which is interesting because it's kind of allowed outsourcing of setting those rules to the private sector. And I think that really is where we're gonna expect a lot of Chinese movement. I think on the one hand, China will try to shape global rules, so we're not going to coerce China with global rules, but they are probably not without reason sharing that globalization is important and that they are willing to shape the rules of the game. It's probably because they see benefits of shaping globalization in their mirror image or in their desired outcomes. And I'm hoping that the pace of wake-up calls around developing countries, I hear this in Africa, of China coming in with sort of new colonial impact in the digital economy is going to also be an opportunity for, hopefully, the democratic countries of this world to show that it's not just a success. Yeah, I'm going to conclude. But what else did I want to say? Oh yeah, the one thing, maybe concluding, because I also listened carefully to what Anu said, is that I'm afraid that the EU will not be doing enough if it's only using regulating of tech companies, whether it be Facebook or Alibaba, but it's possible for those companies to go around the EU completely, to just go into markets and simply either avoid the EU if we're not careful, if we don't have alternative companies either, or accept that they have to regulate a little bit, but use the lack of regulation in all the rest of the world, which will still be very attractive to them. So I think we have to, again, be careful to sort of believe that this regulatory superpower is going to answer all our questions.
Thanks very much. Helle, I don't know if there's one particular that you wanted to pick up on, perhaps the question about the social model in Europe, but I leave to you.
I think the big question is, do we have leverage to actually change what China does? I think that's the big question we have to find out. And I think there is a few fundamental things that we have to get right to actually pick up that leverage and give ourselves agency. First of all, we have to make sure that China is not successful with dividing and ruling between the European nations. I was, as Prime Minister, I was heavily engaged with China. I went there on a state, we had the Queen in China. We had the first ever state visit from China to Denmark where the President came. So heavily engaged in developing our China policies. Very, very good for my own country. And I think also quite successful in actually having these channels of conversation open. But what I would like to see is EU engaging in a similar way with China at all levels, and that goes from economic engagement to cultural engagement to all levels of engagement. I think it can only be a good thing. So we must avoid that China is dividing and ruling. We also must avoid a complete different system of rules. And I see, of course, very positive things coming out of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also very negative things, where perhaps the influence in Africa needs to be pushed back a little bit, particularly if it's about lowering standards. But I'm also, as was being said just now, I'm seeing African leaders trying to push back on that. The Belt and Road Initiative has I don't want to say tentacles, but has arms right into Europe, in Greece, building up harbour in Greece, in Hungary and other European countries, and we have to set certain standards for that. So that, I think, is a prerequisite for engaging. Then on the positive side, if China has an interest in engaging with the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, if European values has a clear spillover into our standards in terms of social standards, data protection standards, freedoms, certain standards of freedom of speech, and environmental standards. Those standards will have an impact on the relationship with China, and we need to leverage that and use that. I see no reason why that is not possible. And the final thing I want to say, I don't think we have a choice. I mean, we're discussing this as if we have a choice whether to engage with China or not. I don't see that choice. If we look at the real big issues we have to solve, and I just want to mention one, climate change. Climate change cannot be solved if we don't engage in a positive way with China. So I think we are back to a question of if there's no choice about whether to have this engagement, we have to use everything we got, all our values, the way we do trading systems, the good relationship we have with China to leverage our influence and create that agency for ourselves based on our interest. And that means that we have to define them. And I hope over the next 5 years, Europe will be much better in defining our own interest in trade, foreign policy, security, and bring them together.
Great, thanks very much. Andrey, I'm going to be slightly unfair because we are at the end of our time, but perhaps I can ask you in just a few short sentences, perhaps interesting to hear your take on China from a Russian perspective.
Well, let me try to say, first of all, on non-Western institutions, I think the good news is that most of these institutions, including the ones that are led by China, are essentially modeled by Western standards. You take the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS, you see they imitate Western institutions, which suggests that the liberal world order is more inclusive than political liberalism. And I think that this is a basic issue, a major issue for all of us, how we find a common denominator for very different political systems. Because, of course, you can argue that EU is not imperialist, but it has been pretty dictatorial in its approach to its partners, and it still is in certain ways. But my second point and the last point, speaking of WTO and the future of the international global system, I think that unfortunately what I see looming on the horizon is a new financial crisis of the scale of what happened in 28-29, because the lessons from this financial meltdown were not learned, the system was not reformed. The difference, however, is that in 2008, major players were ready to cooperate with each other on financial issues. Today, they are not. So my prediction, I'm sorry for being pessimistic, is that the new crisis, when we have one, will be much deeper. The good thing is that it might be a wake-up call, and maybe indeed after having gone through this very painful transformation, we will have the guts and the political will to reform WTO and to raise ourselves to a new level of global governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're at the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our panel for a really rich discussion, I think. And please remain in your seats, because I believe we're transitioning